Boldwood presents In Just One Day, written by Helen McGinn and read by Antonia Beamish. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. There was nothing Flora loved more than a good wine atlas. Well, apart from an actual glass of the stuff, obviously. But when it came to studying the subject of wine, she could get lost in a book of maps for hours. And given the current state of the wine shop, not a single customer in sight, she did indeed have all the time in the world to pore over the contours of the hills of the Côte d'Or, or get lost, on paper at least, in the vineyards of Piedmont. The sound of the bell signalling the door opening made her jump. She quickly closed her book and shoved it under the counter. "Hello, Flora!" "Oh, hi, Colin." Flora's heart sank a little. Then she immediately felt guilty. Colin was a very sweet man, always dressed in matching jumper and trousers, sometimes mustard from head to toe, sometimes red, sometimes blue, but never mixed. He was a regular in the shop, visiting perhaps twice a week, each time to pick a bottle of wine. But choosing that one bottle involved a lengthy chat, and much of that was Colin telling Flora how much he knew about wine, rather than an actual conversation. Flora thought maybe he was just a bit lonely, and if coming in to talk wine to her meant that he wasn't, just for a short while, then she was happy to help, even if her mind often wandered over to her mental to-do list as she listened. "How are we today, Flora?" Colin beamed at her, brushing down the front of his today light blue jumper over his round tummy. "Very well, thank you, Colin. So, what are you in the mood for, wine-wise? What's on the menu tonight?" That was the other thing with Colin. He knew everything about cooking, and would recount in detail how each element of the dish was sourced, then cooked. "Tonight, I'm pushing the boat out, Flora. Tonight," he paused for dramatic effect, "I'm making paella." Flora looked at him quizzically, before remembering that he took on the country of origin's pronunciation of words for added effect. "Ah, paella. How delicious." "Exactly. How delicious. And let me tell you the secret of a great paella." Another pause. Flora racked her brains. "The saffron?" "Oh, no, my dear. The ingredients are the easy part. The secret is in the socarat." "Carrots? In paella?" Flora thought back to the last time she'd eaten paella, ready-made and hastily heated up from Marks and Spencer. She didn't remember it having carrots. "No, not carrots. Socarat. It's the lightly toasted rice at the bottom of the pan. It sort of caramelizes and goes crunchy. And there are certain ways of getting the crust." He looked at her over the counter. "Shall I tell you the best way?" Just then the doorbell went again. Saved by the bell, thought Flora. "Mac, you're back." She greeted him a little too enthusiastically. "I'm so sorry, Colin. I'm going to have to go. But I'm sure Mac would love to know your paella secret." "Your what?" Mac hung his coat up on the wall behind the counter and turned to face them both. His thick white hair stood up at crazy angles, half-moon glasses perched on his nose, with bright blue eyes twinkling behind them. "Paella. It's what I'm making tonight, Mac." "Seafood or traditional recipe?" Mac fixed Colin with a stare over the top of his glasses. Seafood." Colin was suddenly a little less verbose. "Well, then, you'll be needing a bottle of this to go with it." Mac walked across the shop to a shelf on the other side and reached down for a bottle. He turned and held it up. "Rosé? Really? I'm not sure I—" Colin took the bottle. "What is it?" "Spanish Garnacha from Navarra. Just the right balance of fruit and freshness. Not so heavy that it'll drown out the flavours in the dish, but with enough weight to match it. Made by a lovely producer. He farms organically and makes the best paella I've ever eaten." Mac walked back over to the counter. Colin studied the bottle. "Well, if you say it's worth trying, I'll give it a go. I'm not really a rosé man, to be honest, but—" Flora busied herself stuffing her books into her canvas tote bag and picking up her handbag. "Mac, if you don't mind, I've got to run." "Yes, of course, Flora. I'll see you tomorrow." Mac started wrapping the bottle in tissue paper for Colin. "How did it go?" Flora asked Mac quietly as she passed. "I'll tell you in the morning. See you then." He smiled at her, clearly trying his best to make her think there was nothing to worry about. "Thank you kindly, sir." Colin took the bottle from Mac. "Bye, Flora. See you next week." "Yes, and you can tell me how the paella went, and what you thought of the wine." She smiled at him. No doubt Colin would be an expert on rosé by then. "Is that you, Flora?" "Hi, Mum." Her mother, Kate, looked up from Flora's sofa, the floor of the small sitting room covered in books and toys. With her flowing red skirt and multicoloured cardigan, she looked like a fabric rainbow. "Oh, darling, you do look tired." "Wow, thank you." So soon, thought Flora. Her mother usually left it at least a couple of minutes before getting a dig in. Flora had been up late the night before, studying, again. "Sorry, darling, I just mean, I worry about you taking on too much, what with the shop and everything." Flora suspected what really bothered her mother was the fact that she worked in a shop. "Mum, how many times do I have to explain? Having a job that fits in, most of the time, with school hours is a godsend. It's not like I have to commute for miles, and I'm not stuck in an office for hours on end, not to mention that I'm doing something I really love." "But, darling, don't forget the children need you too." "Oh, Mum, please don't do this now. I'm there for them most of the time, and Johnny is really supportive, so I don't see what the problem is." Flora knew that one mention of Johnny and her mother would zip it. Kate adored Johnny. "Anyway, thank you for picking the kids up. Normally they'd go to Tilda's after school today, but one of hers is sick." Tilda had been one of the first friends Flora had made when they'd moved to the area. She lived 5 minutes away, and, with both of them working and having children roughly the same age, they helped each other out as much as they could. "Oh, any time. You know I love seeing them." "Where are they, anyway?" Flora looked out through the French windows into the garden, but there was no sign of the children. She suddenly clocked how quiet it was. "Upstairs, I think. They went to go and clean something." As if on cue, water started to slowly drip from the corner of the ceiling onto the cushion next to Kate. Flora looked up. "Oh, my God! What have they—" She was halfway up the stairs by the time Kate stood up. Flora ran into the bathroom to find water overflowing from the sink, cascading onto the old wooden floorboards and pooling in the corner by the bath. "Pip! Tom!" Flora shrieked, feeling both relief that they were clearly fine and fury that they'd been up to no good. She turned the taps off and threw as many towels as she could get her hands on onto the floor. "We're in here!" Pip called. Flora raced to Pip's room to find her sitting in her wigwam with Tom, their faces lit up by the light of a screen. "Where did you find the iPad? You know you're not supposed to help yourselves. And what have you done in the bathroom?" Pip looked horrified. "Oh, Mum, I'm so sorry. We were trying to clean Tom's comic. He'd drawn on it and wanted to rub the pen off. So we tried to wash it, but it wouldn't come off, so we... Then it started to fall apart in the sink." Tom stood up. "But it's okay, Mama, because Granny gave us this to watch instead." He held out the iPad. "I'm really sorry." Tom swiped his blonde hair with his other hand, his enormous brown eyes looking up at her. "Oh, for God's sake. Well, that was clearly a stupid thing to do, to wash paper in the sink. Come on, Pip, you should know better." "I'm really sorry, Mum. I'll go and clear it up." Pip looked up at her mother, her brown eyes peering through her thick, dark fringe. "No, I'd rather you went downstairs and helped tidy up, and we'll say goodbye to Granny, too." Kate appeared at the door. "Well, Well, now, you two. What were you doing up here? Flora bit her bottom lip. She was so cross, but she knew it wouldn't end well if she reminded her mother that the time to really worry was when the kids were quiet for too long. Oh, you little monkeys. I told you not to let Mummy see you with the iPad. It was supposed to be our secret. Kate winked at them. Flora thought she might actually taste blood if she bit her lip any harder. She took a deep breath. Mum, it's okay. You go. I'm going to clear up the bathroom. The kids can help me. Are you sure? I'd probably just be in the way. I'll get going then. Let me know when you next need me to step in. Flora resisted rolling her eyes. Okay, thanks, Mum. I will. Bye, darlings. Kate blew kisses to Tom first, then Pip. They both waved back and thanked her in unison. I'll let myself out. Bye, Flora sighed. She looked back at the children. Right, let's sort this mess out. Flo, wake up, my love. Johnny tried to wake her without giving her a fright by gently prodding her arm. Flora was at the kitchen table, her face flat against the foothills of the Andes on the pages showing maps of Argentina's vineyards. She opened her eyes, adjusting to the light. She wiped at her mouth and sat up, blinking. What time is it? I must have... It's just past 10. I'm so sorry I'm so late. Trains were a nightmare tonight. Johnny looked down at her, his tie loose at his neck, his face pale with tiredness. Flora rubbed at her eyes, then stretched her arms out wide before wrapping them around Johnny's waist. There's some leftover chicken pie in the oven, if you're hungry. Oh, yes, please. Have we got any baked beans? I'm sure we have. Flora held on to him for a moment before letting him go, taking in the warmth and smell of his skin through his shirt. He ruffled her long brown hair. Thank you. How's it going? He walked over to the oven and peered inside. What, this? Flora looked down at the pile of books, the files of work and stack of notebooks. She sighed, pulling her hair back and tying it into a messy bun on top of her head. Sometimes I worry that I'm doing all of this work, and when it gets to the exams, I'm not going to remember a thing. I can barely remember where I left a cup of tea half the time, let alone what Burgundy's best Chardonnay clone is. Chardonnay what? Johnny grabbed a tin from the cupboard. Oh, don't worry. It's very boring, really. Unless you own a vineyard in Burgundy, of course. Anyway, Mac had his meeting with the bank today. How did it go? I don't know yet. Colin was in the shop. Colin's always in the shop. Yes, but unfortunately, we cannot run on his custom alone. He only buys a bottle a week, 2 at a push. Shame. Tell me about it. Anyway, we couldn't really talk, so Mac said he'd fill me in tomorrow. Honestly, I think he's hanging on by a thread. I've told him to let me go, that he doesn't really need me, but he won't. He knows how much you love that job, that's why. And it wouldn't be much fun sitting in an empty wine shop all day on your own, would it? I know, but still. I do feel we're nearing the end of this happy arrangement, and that makes me really sad. Flora sighed. She closed her makeshift pillow and piled it up with the other books. Well, see what he says tomorrow. There's nothing you can do about it now. You need sleep. Go on, go to bed, and I'll be in as soon as I'm done here. Johnny poured a glass of water and passed it over to her. Here. Thank you. Slowly she got up and started climbing the stairs. Johnny waited until she was gone. He let out a long breath. He'd meant to tell her as soon as he came in. All the way home on the train he'd been planning how to break it to her. But telling her he'd just been made redundant, face to face, wasn't nearly as straightforward as he'd imagined. Chapter 2. Flora hadn't ever actually planned to get into wine in a serious way. It had all happened rather by accident. She'd spent the first 5 years of her working life in advertising with a number of large London firms. She'd loved the pace and glamour of it at first. She'd once flown to New York for lunch. But after a while, something began to gnaw away at her. A sense that what she was doing didn't really matter, at least not to her. Around that time, she'd met Johnny. He was a friend of a friend, and they'd met at a party, both taking refuge in the kitchen to get away from the karaoke in the other room. Flora had not long extricated herself from a long-term relationship with someone from work. Her boss, in fact. Not the smartest move she'd ever made. And getting into another relationship definitely wasn't the plan. But then meeting Johnny wasn't in her plan either. Previous boyfriends included a musician, disaster, and a before-he-was-famous actor, also a disaster. Johnny just seemed so uncomplicated compared to her usual type, and as the months passed, he continued to pursue her with gentle persuasion rather than grand gestures. Before long, her resolve to stay single for a while was forgotten, and Flora had never been happier. Everything was perfect, in fact, except for her job, which by now she hated. It was Johnny who suggested one evening over noodles at their favourite local restaurant that she might look at evening courses at a local college. To do what? Flora spoke through a mouthful. Well, that's the point. They're bound to offer all sorts of courses. It might lead you to something you've never even thought of. Johnny took a sip from his bottle of beer. Look, you've been doing this job for how long? Too long. Feels like a lifetime. Exactly. Come on, you need to find something you really love doing, and now's the time to start doing it. What do you think? He looked genuinely excited. The fact that he was so invested in her happiness slightly threw her, in a good way. Previous boyfriends had all been far more interested in themselves to worry about a girlfriend's growing existential crisis. Fine. I'll have a look online tomorrow. I promise. Of course, Flora hadn't looked the next day, or that week, and before long months had gone by, and she still hadn't done anything about it. She was ridiculously busy at work, but with every day that passed, she felt more nauseous about going in. She and Johnny were still hopping between each other's flats, which suited them both. It seemed too soon to have the "shall we move in together" chat. It had been barely 6 months since they'd met. So no one was more surprised than Flora when she realised she was pregnant. That growing sick feeling in her stomach hadn't been about the job at all. It had been the work of a very tiny human growing inside her. At first she'd put off finding out for sure, not wanting to see it in black and white, or rather in blue lines on a stick. But after a week or so of knowing in her bones that she was almost certainly pregnant, she took a test and called Johnny. "Is everything okay? You sound a bit weird." She could picture his face, a frown on his forehead. "Yes, I'm fine. But I need to talk to you, like now." Are we... Johnny, please, can you just come?" "On my way." 20 minutes later, they sat in Flora's flat, looking down at the pregnancy test in front of them. "Johnny, I'm so sorry." "Hang on. What do you mean? I think you'll find I had something to do with this too. Why are you apologising?" "I know, I just thought... Anyway, whatever. What do we do now?" She looked at him, his eyes still fixed on the thick blue line. He closed them for a second, then slowly turned to face her. "I want you to marry me." "What?" Flora stared at him in disbelief. "Are you serious?" Johnny's blue eyes sparkled. "Well, I've never proposed before, but I'm pretty sure it's not something you ask for fun." He took her hands in his. "Flora, I'm sure this might not be quite what you had in mind, but I'm being absolutely serious. In fact, I don't think I've ever been so sure of anything in my life. I love you, Flo." I... Flora wasn't sure which was more surprising, finding out she was pregnant or being proposed to. "Johnny, don't know what to say. I just didn't think I'd be having a baby quite yet. I thought I'd be in my 30s, not my 20s. But that's the thing. The plan is ours to make together. He tilted her face to his, with his hand under her chin. Come on. What do you reckon? Are you up for it? A wide grin spread across his face, so wide it made his eyes crinkle at the edges. Flora swallowed hard. I'm in. Is that a yes? He laughed, springing up from the sofa. Yes, it's a yes. Flora stood up to meet him, and he picked her up, twirling her around, before falling back gently onto the sofa, both of them lost in tears and kisses. Telling friends had been a doddle. Informing their parents, on the other hand, had been slightly more painful, at least for Flora. Her parents had met and married when they were young, barely a penny between them, as Kate often liked to remind Flora and her brother Billy. And even though they were so different, or maybe because they were, the marriage had always been a happy one, as far as Flora knew. She couldn't help but feel she had a lot to live up to. Her father had been delighted. Kate, on the other hand, had been all smiles, but Flora could sense her disappointment. This was not how Kate had imagined this moment at all. So, where will you live? I mean, you can't bring up a baby in your tiny flat, can you? Kate asked Flora. Well, we'll have to for a while. I'm going to move into Johnny's flat and sell mine. We're thinking of trying to find somewhere with a bit more space. A small garden, perhaps? But not yet. Flora tried to sound as upbeat as possible, ignoring the look on her mother's face. What about work? Kate probed further. Actually, Mum, I've been thinking about changing career anyway. Since when? Kate's mouth dropped open. Darling, we didn't know you were unhappy. Her father was clearly concerned. I'm not. It's just, well, I'm really not exactly loving the advertising business anymore, so I'm going to explore other options, that's all. And have a baby, and get married. I'm not sure it's the right time to take stock. Do you, Robin? Kate turned to her husband. Mum, it's exactly the right time. For me, I mean. Please just trust me. Us. Flora looked at Johnny. To work it out? Of course we will. Her father looked at her mother. Kate's mouth was open like a goldfish's. He turned back and smiled at them. Now, shall we open something to celebrate? That would be great. Thank you, Robin. Johnny looked back at Kate. We'll make it work. I promise. Kate sighed. Well, I certainly hope so. Flora, come and help me choose something from the garage. I'm sure I've got a decent bottle stuffed away in there somewhere. Her father gestured for her to join him. Grateful for the chance to escape before she said anything she shouldn't to her mother, Flora followed. Robin put his arm around his daughter as they made their way outside. Don't worry about Mum. She'll come round eventually. It's just a bit of a shock, that's all. 2 big bits of news at once, and we've only just met Johnny. Not that that matters. He's wonderful, Flora. You seem very happy together. Dad, we really are. And I'm sorry it's not quite how you imagined things to happen, but I am really happy. Apart from the job. But I guess you can't have everything. So, what else do you think you might want to do? Honestly, I haven't a clue. What about this one? Flora pulled a bottle from the wine rack and held it up. Ooh, Cremant. This'll do nicely. Darling, I don't even know what that is, or where it came from. Let me have a look. He took the bottle from her. It's not cold, but stick it in the freezer for 10 minutes and it'll be fine to toast with. Not that I can go anywhere near it. The smell of wine makes me want to throw up at the moment. That's it! Wine! His face lit up. What do you mean? Flora was confused. Why don't you do a proper wine course? An evening course, perhaps? You've always been interested in what's on the table. I never really know, to be honest. I just like drinking it. He chuckled. passing her back the bottle. "Come on, tell me more about this one." "Well," she looked at the label. "It's from Burgundy. Look, here. Crémant de Bourgogne." She pointed at the words. So basically, it's made in the same way as champagne, but from a different area. I've no idea how old it is because it's non-vintage, but there's only one way to find out if it's any good. You see? You're a natural. Oh, come on. I went to a wine tasting once, and that was with work. Everyone just got pissed, including me. Yes, but you're interested in it. Always have been, really. Didn't you join the wine society at university? Yes, but that's because it was the cheapest way to get 4 half glasses of wine on a Thursday night. Well, it's just a thought. He looked at her, an eyebrow raised. Later that evening, when they got back to Johnny's flat, Flora curled up on the bed in her pyjamas and opened her laptop. Indeed, it was just a thought, but it was a good one. She typed, "Wine courses near me," into the search bar. "Hey, Johnny, there's one not far from here I could do, 1 evening a week, and then there's a test at the end." "So you'd get a proper certificate?" He came in from the bathroom, toothbrush in hand. "Yes, it's just the most basic certificate, but it's a start, and it says it's a great introduction for anyone thinking of making a career out of wine." "Sign up before you change your mind. I think it's a brilliant idea. I'll never have to worry about looking like an idiot with the wine list again." Flora was so used to the cold blanket of dread covering her on a Sunday night ahead of going back to work. But now she realised that for the first time for years, it just wasn't there. In fact, for a moment, she was excited at the prospect of what might just lie ahead. Then she caught herself. "Hang on, Johnny. Am I being completely stupid? I don't mean getting married, obviously, or having a baby, but throwing in a career change at the same time. Really? Look, if you don't do it now, you might never do it. There's nothing stopping you. Now go on. Put your name down before you change your mind." Flora looked back at the screen, the cursor blinking on the page, and typed in her name. Chapter 3. Mac was not in sight when Flora got to the shop the next day, although the smell of freshly made coffee gave away his presence. "Good morning, Mac," Flora called out. "Hello, Flora. With you in a minute." He was in the stockroom. At least, that's what they called it. Basically, it was a room at the back, stuffed from floor to ceiling with boxes and wooden crates. Flora had tried to install some sort of stock rotation system, but with so little room, Mac hadn't seemed to notice. The shop sat on the high street in a small market town. It occupied a 2-storey whitewashed brick building with a green awning hanging over 2 windows at the front. The name of the shop, 10 Green Bottles, in thick white lettering across it. Inside, the room was narrow but long, with exposed brick walls and old wooden floorboards giving the space a wonderful cellar-type feel. Thick, dark wood shelves, built by Mac himself back when he first opened the shop in the early 1980s, were loaded with wines. It looked like a mad sweet shop for grown-ups. In the early days, he'd enjoyed roaring trade, with a long list of loyal customers, both private and in the restaurant trade, keeping the business hearty and healthy. Mac had even opened a bar in the back of the shop in the tiny courtyard garden for a while. But then the recession hit, and to make matters worse, a supermarket opened up smack bang opposite the shop, on the sunnier side of the street. It wasn't a huge supermarket, more express size, but Mac struggled to compete with their prices. For years now, the shop had limped on, barely covering its costs, but Mac loved his customers and did everything he could to keep them happy. He held monthly wine tastings in the shop, his clients perched on wooden boxes, trying his latest finds from tiny producers in France, Italy, Spain, or some remote region further afield that it was unlikely anyone had heard of. He'd always had help in the shop, not least because he needed someone to run the place when he was out making deliveries. But more than that, it was for the company. He'd lived on his own since his wife, Elizabeth, had died almost 10 years ago. They'd been together for over 40 years, and he'd adored her. The irony was, she hadn't even liked wine that much. Flora remembered Mac mentioning his son, just the once, when she'd asked him one day if he had any children. We did, but he died too, sadly. He'd not offered any more than that, not even a name. Flora sensed from this response that it wasn't something Mac wished to talk about, and she'd quickly changed the subject. "Ah, there you are." Mac emerged from the back, glasses askew. "I know I've got some Chateau Palmer 85 back there somewhere. I just can't for the life of me remember where I put it. Old Mr. Peters called yesterday asking if we had any. Wants it for a birthday present." "Yes, you have, and I think I know exactly where it is. Let me go. I'll just put this stuff down." Flora shrugged off her coat and went to put her bag on the shelf below the counter. "No books today?" Mac had got used to Flora carting the heavy tote bag with her everywhere she went. "Not today, Mac. I've got to the point where I feel like every time I learn one thing, I forget another. So I'm giving it a break for a bit." The truth was, she knew that she and Mac would need to have a proper talk about the future of the shop, and she was fully expecting to be sent home today with an apology that her job was no longer viable. And as much as that saddened her, the thought of Mac losing his shop broke her heart even more. She'd wanted to talk to Johnny about it before he left for work, but he was up and gone by the time she'd woken up that morning. "Coffee? I've just made it." Mac poured out 2 cups and handed one to her. "Thank you. So, how did yesterday go?" "At the bank?" Mac took a long sip of his coffee. "Not great." "Oh, Mac, I'm so sorry. What did they say?" "I can't get another loan, I'm afraid. They said they've done all they can. I'm going to have to sell the lease, possibly the building." "But where will you live?" Flora immediately thought of Mac's flat upstairs. It was remarkably similar to the shop, just with books rather than wine lining the walls, and piled up in every corner. She couldn't bear the thought of Mac losing his home. "I'm not sure yet. I hadn't really thought about it. But the shop's going to have to go. I've tried, but it's just not making enough to keep trading. Not by a long way, I'm afraid." "I'm so sorry. That's awful. I don't know what to say." Flora reached across and put her hand gently on his arm. Mac looked at her, his face softening with a smile. "Honestly, I knew it was coming. Has been for a while. But I had just hoped that we'd have enough business to keep us ticking over. Technically, I should have retired long ago, but to be honest, I wouldn't know what else to do." He looked around the shop. "I built this place, but you know what? It's only bricks and bottles. All good things, as they say." "There must be something we can do, Mac. How about a proper marketing campaign? We could start online wine courses or pop-up tastings or, I don't know, how about running a mini wine festival?" Flora was speaking quickly, wishing she'd pushed him harder to consider these ideas long before now. She had tried in the past, but he'd always insisted they were fine as they were. "You're kind, Flora, but really, it's too late. I've already been to the estate agents at the bottom of the high street. They're coming to have a look at the place later. I really am so sorry. But let me know if there is anything I can do in terms of a reference for another job, and I'll pay you for another month's work." "You don't have to do that, Mac. I know you've done what you can. This must be so very hard for you." Flora felt desperately sad. "Thank you. I just wish it didn't have to be this way." Mac looked at her, his eyes glinting with tears. "Now, did you say you knew where that bottle of Palmer was? Mr. Peters will be here to pick it up soon." "Glass of wine?" Flora grabbed 2 glasses from the dresser and put them on the table. "Sorry about the mess." "I can't believe you're apologising for the mess. Have you seen my house?" Tilda laughed as she picked up the empty beakers from the table. "Yes, please. Thanks for feeding them today. You didn't have to do that. Pleasure. I owe you anyway. Flora put the glasses on the table, unscrewed the wine and poured a generous measure into each. From the garden, the squeals of the children reached them as they flipped and flung themselves at each other on the trampoline. Please be careful. You've only just finished eating, Flora called across to them, only to be completely ignored. Cheers. She raised her glass to her friends. Cheers. Happy Friday. Tilda took a long sip. God, that's good. What is it? Pinot Gris from New Zealand. A bit like Pinot Grigio, but with more meat on its bones. You like? I like. Very much, actually. So when's the exam? Exams, plural. Flora looked at her glass. In a couple of months, and that's just the first lot. I've got to do another load of exams next year, too. So, is this like a diploma? Exactly. God knows what I was thinking when I decided to do it. Flora absent-mindedly swirled her glass as she spoke. I think I might have been temporarily deranged. Oh, come on. If you're going to take exams, at least you're doing ones where you get to drink wine. I know. I really shouldn't complain. It had all started with that evening course. Flora had turned up thinking that if she just did a few classes, it would get it out of her system before going back to her old job, and that would be that. Instead, before the end of that first evening, she knew she'd found something she loved. And it wasn't just about whatever wine was in the glass. She fell in love with everything about it, from the people who made the wine, the place it was from, the culture surrounding it, the combination of tradition and innovation, the assault on the senses, all captured in that glass. The whole thing absolutely fascinated her. Within a few months, she'd completed the evening course, gaining her first official wine qualification, and promptly signed up to do the next level before she changed her mind. Shortly after Pip had been born, and when her bosses at work had refused her request for a part-time role, she'd resigned, switching instead to earning a modest income from copywriting through old work contacts. Meanwhile, Johnny was making good money from his job, enough for them to sell his flat, move out of the city, and buy a small house in a quiet seaside village on the south coast. It was a small Victorian red brick house set back from the road, reached by a gravel track, and had, as the estate agent put it, lots of potential. Of course, they'd had grand plans when they'd first arrived, of knocking down walls and creating an open-plan, modern living space. But apart from giving the whole place a lick of paint, the house was still pretty much as it had been when they'd first moved in. Still, as Flora often reminded herself, one spent more time in a house looking out than the other way round. And the views from the inside out were quite spectacular, the small garden backing onto fields with woodland behind. Best of all, the beach was a 5-minute walk away, miles of shingle overlooking the Solent and the Isle of Wight beyond that. As soon as Pip had started nursery, Flora had gone back to studying wine part-time from home, gaining a further 2 certificates, along with another baby in between. By now, she was itching to get back to something other than churning out copy for advertorials found in the back of magazines. So it was, she found herself sitting in Mac's shop one day, with her 2-year-old son Tom asleep in the buggy, begging him to give her a job. But what about this wee fella? Mac pointed at the boy, cheeks flushed hot with sleep. I've got a place for him at nursery starting next term, so I'd be free 3 days a week to come and work for you. She'd been so eager, Mac hadn't the heart to say no. A month later, Flora started working in the shop. She'd been able to keep up her studies, signing up for the wine diploma that she was now almost halfway through, and thinking that she just might have bitten off more than she could chew. You love doing this stuff, really. Your mind would turn to mush without it. Tilda shrugged, her glass waving in the air. I know, you're right. Anyway, how's your work going? Flora emptied a couple of packets of teddy bear-shaped crisps into a bowl. Sorry, it's all I can find. Well, being a doctor's receptionist isn't exactly the most taxing job in the world, but at least I know exactly who's on Viagra in this small town. Flora's eyes widened. Really? Oh, you'd be amazed. They might look old, but my goodness, there are plenty of them still having a lot of fun. Must be all that sea air. And I'm a pro at finding out who's doing what with whom. Flora laughed out loud. Really? What do you mean? Well, it started when someone came into the surgery claiming he'd no idea where he'd picked up a particular, ailment. But a few quick searches, and I found pictures of him on Facebook with someone who definitely wasn't his wife. Let's just leave it at that. Tilda winked at her friend and took another sip of her wine. How's the shop? Flora sighed. Not so good, actually. Mac's got to sell. Seriously? Oh, that's so sad. Tilda's face fell. Why? It's been on the cards for a while, but I just thought, he's managed to keep it going all these years. I'm sure he'll think of something. But it turns out trade is just too slow. He's done. What will you do? I mean, do you think it might stay as a wine shop? I've no idea. If he can't make it work, and he's been there forever, then I'm not sure anyone can. Rubbish. It's not enough to just sit there with a shop and expect people to come to you these days. You've got to go out and find them. Tilda was adamant. I know. I've been through all this with Mac, but he doesn't want to try. It's his shop, and, well, he says he's done with it. What about Johnny? Can't he help with setting up an online shop or whatever? I mean, he does that kind of thing at work, doesn't he? Flora shrugged. Johnny did work in IT, but she had never been entirely sure what he did exactly. Selling software packages, she knew that much. Actually, Johnny doesn't know yet. I only found out this morning and he hasn't picked up my calls all day. I know he's been really busy at work. I even tried his direct number today. He was in meetings for most of the day, apparently. Flora topped up their glasses. She gave hers another swill, sticking her nose in to savour the aroma, all limes and nectarines. Just this, then I must go. Tilda turned to the open window. Kids, 5 minutes, okay? They all stopped and turned for a split second before resuming their bouncing. Well, whatever happens, here's to Pinot Gris. I think it's my new favourite. Flora clinked Tilda's glass. You always say that. Chapter 4. Mac sat back in his chair, a well-thumbed copy of Great Expectations in his hand. He'd picked it up from a stack of books on the side in an attempt to take his mind off the situation, even for just a few moments. But it hadn't worked. He sighed and reached for his glass, taking a long sniff. The smell of old leather and spice filled his nose. The wine inside was brick red in colour, an Australian Shiraz, at least 20 years old. Instantly, the aromas in the glass took him back to the time when he'd arrived in London from Australia looking for work. He'd walked into a pub to ask for a job. The pub was practically empty save for the landlord and a couple of regulars propping up the bar. But before long, Mac was running it, turning the place from a beer-soaked boozer into a heaving wine bar serving wines from all over the world. His best-selling wine was an Australian Shiraz, which was something of a novelty back then. Soon, one bar became 3, then 5 across the city, before he sold the business and retired to the south coast with his wife Elizabeth and their young son Jamie, who'd just turned 12. He hadn't intended to open a wine shop, but there wasn't one nearby, so, for mainly selfish reasons, 10 Green Bottles was opened on the site of an old antique shop in a listed building at the top of the town. Mac's neighbours included a bakery on one side and a hardware shop on the other. He had renovated the space, stripping the plaster from the walls, taking them back to the original brickwork and crafting shelves from locally sourced oak. He and Elizabeth had also set about turning the dingy flat upstairs into a home for the 3 of them. She had made curtains, cleaned carpets, cleared cupboards, and painted furniture, transforming it into something quite charming. Soon, the shelves in the shop were stacked with wines. Now all Mac needed were some customers. But London was very different from this small seaside town. Barely a dozen people came through the door in the first few weeks. "How about we throw a free wine tasting so people can see what you're all about?" Elizabeth suggested. The next day, Mac placed an advert in the local paper. Elizabeth ran up some bunting to decorate the courtyard garden, and Jamie posted flyers through the door of every shop and house the length of the high street and beyond. The day of the tasting arrived, and Mac had opened 50 different bottles, wines from all over the world, lined up on tables for people to try for themselves. Plates of bruschetta and crudités sat on side tables dotted around the courtyard, assembled by them both early that morning. The sun shone brightly in a cloudless blue sky above, but still no one came. "Where is everyone? What's wrong with these people? I'm offering them free wine." Mac was exasperated. Elizabeth sprang up from her chair. "If they won't come to us, let's take it to them. Instead of sitting out here at the back where no one can see us, why don't we set up the tables at the front of the shop instead? Jamie, run and get some paper cups from next door. Then we can give them a taste, and that'll get them in." By the middle of the afternoon, the courtyard was rammed. Mac was in his element, pouring wines for people, telling them stories about the winemakers and the places the wines had come from. He asked what sort of style they liked and found them new things to try. Elizabeth scribbled orders and took down customers' details in a big black book. Jamie had positioned the old stereo upstairs by the window at the back, and as the afternoon went on, the sounds from Mac's jazz record collection floated down across the courtyard. By the time the last customer left, it was almost dark. "Thank you, my darling," Mac called across to Elizabeth, as they both cleared plates from tables strewn with empty bottles and dirty glasses. "If it wasn't for you, I'd still be waiting for people to walk through the door." "They just need a bit of persuading, that's all," Elizabeth smiled. "I spoke to quite a few who said they didn't really drink wine, but then they tried something they hadn't tried before and loved it." "Exactly. That's the thing. People seem to think it's all crusty clarets and expensive burgundy. But wine should be for anyone who wants to try it, not just for those with money." "I think we're onto something, Elizabeth." "Mac, if you can pass on just a drop of your enthusiasm for the stuff, then yes, I think you're onto something." "I said we, Elizabeth. You and Jamie, too. That was a team effort today." "Thank you. Come on, let's get this place tidied up. You need this place shipshape and ready for business on Monday morning. Where's Jamie? Jamie?" She called up to the window, music still playing softly through it. Jamie stuck his head out. "I'm here." "Right, you. Time for bed. It's getting late, and you look exhausted."